Now, when you begin to talk about raising the minimum wage, a lot of people immediately get this fear, thanks to certain propaganda and talking points, that it will destroy small businesses. Now, of course, understandably, the people who are most worried are the small business owners themselves. People like Bill Phelps. Now, Phelps is the CEO of a place called Wetzel's Pretzels in California. Now, it actually has almost 100 outlets in California. It is a small business. Now, he told KQED News that when California voted to raise its minimum wage back in the middle of 2014, he was worried about the impact that it would have on his small business. Now, he told the local news station that, quote, like most business people, I was pretty concerned about it. Now, why? Well, currently California, as I said, is on track to raise their minimum wage. Now, they want to reach $15 an hour by 2022. Now, it raised the wage in both mid-2014 and January 1st for companies over 25 employees. So, companies like Wetzel's Pretzels. Now, understandably, Phelps and a lot of small business fast food CEOs have been worried that these wage increases will end up cutting into their profits, and that if they end up having to raise their prices to compensate for that, fewer people will frequent their restaurants, and they'll end up losing money, they'll end up losing business. So when the wage went into effect, Phelps prepared for the worst. So, what happened with Wetzel's Pretzels? Well, it turns out sales didn't go down. Profits didn't go down. In fact, they exploded. Phelps told KQED, quote, I was shocked. I was stunned by the business. Now, fast forward to 2016, when the same thing happened again. The minimum wage ended up rising January 1st. I'm sorry, it rose earlier in 2016. There's another raise that happened January 1st. Now, after that second raise, Phelps said, quote, there was another wage increase and then boom, a bump in same-store sales across the state that held for most of the year. And now because of this, because his business ends up booming, he is now convinced that minimum wages aren't bad for the fast food industry. In fact, he says, no, these minimum wage increases are actually great for business. They're great for me. Why? Because they actually work. Now, franchise owner Mike Jacobs, who owns a franchise of Wetzel's Pretzels, actually has a similar story. He says, quote, my overall sales were something like 15% ahead of the first minimum wage bump, and now they're about 12% ahead this year. It isn't because I'm such a great manager or smart guy, but it's because the buying public has more money in their pocket. Now imagine that. When people have more money, they actually end up spending more money. They buy more things. It doesn't take a genius to figure that one out. And look, if you want to look at this on a larger scale, look at Seattle. Seattle raised their minimum wage to a living wage, and it turns out the restaurant industry is booming. Now you might be asking, yeah, but what about jobs? What about automation? Well, for jobs, there was a UC Berkeley economist named David Card that looked at the study between, or the relationship between raising the minimum wage and employment. Now, he did that by studying the minimum wage for over 2 decades. Now, in the early 90s, he published a case study that showed that increasing the minimum wage did not reduce employment, which means it didn't cause unemployment, like a lot of the doomsayers have said. Now, Card said that colleagues have long suspected that rising the minimum wage not only doesn't reduce employment, but it actually increases fast food sales in the United States. Now, however, there is one issue here, and there is not a lot of detailed sales data on this, on how much of an impact it actually has. Why? Because fast food companies don't really want to hand over that information. Now, to that, Card says, quote, there's been a lot of speculation, but no one has figured out how to obtain the data. If the data held up to analysis and Phelps is right, Card said it could help clear up a lot of misconceptions about the minimum wage that are currently being touted as factual information. Now, right now, for example, people think that raising the minimum wage will be bad for small businesses and business in general, even though there isn't a lot of data to back that up. In fact, there's a lot of the opposite that is coming out. But unfortunately, Card says that a lot of these economists continue to perpetuate this idea because they're being political and not scientific. Quote, unfortunately, economists unfortunately have within the crowd quite a few people who are ideologically committed to the idea that any kind of price regulation is always bad. And that is, of course, unfortunately, because some of these people have either bought into that narrative and actually believe it, or they're paid by the fast food lobbyists in order to not believe it. But again, what we have is we have evidence, not so much in hard numbers, in exact percentages, but in stories like Phelps. You also have cities, again, like successes like Seattle. And, of course, if you want to look at the opposite, where they don't raise their minimum wage, where they've prevented minimum wage increases, you have places like, for example, Ohio, you have Kansas. You can look at the unemployment numbers and the standards of living for people living in those areas and compare them to what's going on in California and Seattle. And when you look at those, you actually see a big difference. You realize that higher wages, more money in people's pockets, actually ends up leading to a better economy overall and a more happy and productive workforce. Now, on the issue of automation, look, there are a lot of people that are rightly worried that there's going to be more automation, and I understand that. And I do think personally that automation is going to happen whether or not we raise the minimum wage. So it might happen a little bit faster. So what do we do when that happens? Well, I think the future is a UBI, Universal Basic Income. But that's not going to be there for a while. And what we have is we've got two different choices here. Either we go the dystopian route, where automation has taken all the jobs and there's a permanent, incredibly poor underclass. Or you have a UBI, where people can now get trained to do other jobs that have since been automated and actually create new businesses and new things. Those are the directions that we have to go. But as far as this goes, for right now, let's raise the minimum wage. So until that automation happens, let's make sure that everybody can actually have a decent standard of living and make a living wage. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent, non-corporate media, go to our Patreon page and become a patron. Patreon.com/TYTNation.